Hawk 53516 has an emergency. I need to land at runway 6 at Potomac Airfield.
Number 516, Roger. Do you have any visibility out of the window?
Not much on my windscreen.
Do you have any ground contact?
Yeah, I can see a bit.
Okay. You see the Potomac River that you're flying over right now?
Yeah, I'm over the marina.
Okay. Do you feel comfortable navigating on your own to the airport, or would you like vectors?
I'm okay for actually. Give me a vector.
Number 516, Roger. Fly heading 060.
060, 516.
You just heard audio from episode 101 in which we interviewed a student pilot whose windshield was suddenly covered with oil. Today we have an update to her story and others we've covered in the past year. Hello again and welcome to Aviation News Talk, a weekly show with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Trescott. Today I'm bringing you updates on some of our most popular stories from the past year, something we like to call, with apologies to Paul Harvey, the rest of the story. Now, you can probably hear that I'm not in my home studio. I'm actually in a hotel room in Medford, Oregon, because I'm still on the road after 4 trips across the country, moving new Vision Jets and an SR20T from the Cirrus factory to California. And if you listen to the very end of this show, I'll tell you the rest of my story and how I ended up in Knoxville 3 times in 1 week. And a quick thank you to the many people who've recently sent me messages via Facebook Messenger and email. Thanks so much for your well wishes for the holidays and for your kind words about this show and how much it means to you. I'm happy to hear I'm making an impact in your life to help make you become a safer pilot. I'll read a couple of your messages at the end of the show. Today we have updates on the student pilot whose windshield was suddenly covered with oil on her first solo cross-country flight. And we have updates from 2 pilots, Robert DeLaurentis and John Bone, about their planned flights to Antarctica. And we talk with Cirrus about what's new with the Vision Jet. But first, let's start with an update from Jason Blair, who gave me a mock IFR Checkride in episode 129. Now, that was one of our most popular episodes, but I also heard from many listeners who questioned whether Jason was right about a particular question he asked me. I think that was the only question to which I answered, I'm not sure, and apparently you weren't sure either. So here's Jason Blair with his explanation.
Hey Max, Jason Blair here, and trying to help clarify a couple of questions that came up on the recent podcast we did that was a simulated instrument kind of check ride there. We had a lot of good questions and discussion, but one of them that has generated a bunch of discussion after is the question of, can you use a safety pilot in actual IMC conditions? And this gets a little bit confusing when we have to dig down into the rules a little bit. And I'm going to tell you, I am a little bit conservative on this, but a lot of our listeners have asked the question of, well, why can't you, if the safety pilot, who is not a double I, not a CF double I, is current as a pilot for instrument conditions, if the flying pilot, the person who wants to get current, is the sole manipulator of the controls, but we file the flight plan or act under instrument rules using the current pilot, who's maybe a private pilot with an instrument rating who could be a safety pilot, and go do that in actual IMC conditions or even just filed under actual IMC rules. And this gets a little bit confusing, and a lot of folks take a look at this and say, but if I'm the sole manipulator of the controls, I get to act and log that for currency. And in many cases, that's a very correct statement. However, when we dig into this a little bit further, and I want to be clear here, we're looking at this as a pilot who is trying to get current, but is not current for instrument flight conditions. They've let those 6 approaches go, or they have not had an IPC within the preceding requisite months. And then we have another pilot who is not a CF double I, but is a current instrument, whether private or commercial or ATP pilot, who could fly in actual instrument conditions. The provisions the FAA gives us for that is when we're using a safety pilot, we can actually allow 2 people to log PIC time because the operation then requires 2 crew members. So if I've not made this muddy enough, we're going to get a little bit further down in this. So if we think about this, a person, according to 61.3, is not able to act as PIC of a civil aircraft under IFR, basically the rules, or in weather conditions less than the prescribed VFR, unless the person has an instrument rating and is current to do so. So when we act with a safety pilot, they are both acting as PIC in some respects here. So we can't let them log that unless we're in simulated IFR conditions. If we go a little bit further in this, we have an FAA interpretation in 2001. It's a Walker interpretation that talks about whether a safety pilot can be used in actual IMC conditions. And if we read into it a little bit, the Walker legal interpretation notes that a safety pilot is a pilot who occupies a control seat in an aircraft during simulated instrument flight, okay, and who possesses at least a private pilot certificate, category, class to the aircraft being flown. They go on and say if pilots A and B in this airplane, so the safety pilot and the primary pilot, are flying in actual IMC conditions, not in simulated flight conditions, the aircraft operation is not one for which more than one pilot is required. The regulations under which the flight is being conducted then say that the pilot A is not acting as a safety pilot. So the key in this interpretation, it seems to be that the safety pilot time is designated by the FARs to only occur when it's in simulated instrument conditions, and that it does not apply when in actual IMC conditions. If we follow that through a little bit further, and certainly this is a conservative approach for me, but one that I'm basing on FAA interpretations I've seen, it indicates that we would not be acting with a safety pilot when we're in actual instrument conditions. The regulations state that's for simulated IFR conditions, and that when we have a pilot who is not instrument current and we're trying to act with another pilot, they don't actually meet the qualifications of or the definitions of safety pilot under those conditions. So even if we have the non-current pilot as the sole manipulator of the controls, that provision doesn't seem to allow us to do that in actual IMC conditions. And this is the basis for the logic when I said in the podcast, we cannot use a non-CFII to get us current as a safety pilot in actual IMC conditions. The practical application of this is if we have a pilot who has fallen out of instrument currency and wants to regain currency by flying with a safety pilot, is that they would have to do so in VFR conditions. Hope that helps, everyone.
Thank you for that, Jason. Now, one of our all-time most popular episodes was 101, in which a student pilot who was on her first cross-country solo suddenly had her windshield covered with oil and lost all forward visibility. We also interviewed Casey Whitaker, the controller who helped talk her down. I recently called her on the phone to find out what's new with her, and here's what she told me. Since we aired that episode, she has completed her private and her instrument rating, and she's now working on a commercial multi-engine rating, and she's planning to do her single-engine commercial next. She's also passed her Advanced Ground Instructor Certificate and is actively teaching ground topics to students. She also works the front desk for the flight school where she's working on her ratings. And that, by the way, is something I recommend all the time to people who are interested in becoming a CFI. Just take the written test for the FOI exam, Fundamentals of Instruction, and take the written exam for the AGI, the Advanced Ground Instructor, and or the IGI, or Instrument Ground Instructor. Then you can teach ground to student pilots and instrument pilots, which is a great way to sharpen your skills and prepare you for becoming a CFI. Now, oddly, the last thing she told me is that she recently had a second incident in which she had engine trouble. Hard to believe. Fortunately, she was very close to an airport. She headed for it immediately and was able to get on the ground safely. And also, fortunately, she remains undeterred in her desire to fly for a living. I'm guessing she's looking forward to transitioning to turbine engines as quickly as possible, as they have far fewer engine failures than piston engines. Now, nearly a year ago in episode 96, I interviewed Cirrus Vision Jet product manager Matt Bergwall as we sat in the back of the very first Vision Jet G2, which flies higher and faster than the original Vision Jet, and which has an auto throttle. During one of my recent visits to Knoxville, I caught up with Matt to get an update on this plane. I'm sitting here in a conference room with Matt Bergwall, and Matt, we talked back in January about the Vision Jet G2. It's December now. What's new in the last year?
Well, our biggest new feature that was added to the Vision Jet since the Generation 2 launch in January was Safe Return, our emergency auto land system that is now available on our G2 Vision Jets.
And I'm going to be back here in a week to pick up a G2, and I'm told that it's already got some components of Autoland in it. Tell me about that, and are there differences in the G2s that are being shipped versus the ones shipped earlier this year?
So Safe Return is going to be able to be retrofitted on all Generation 2 airplanes. We're still waiting certification for the Safe Return system. So what we did on some of the models that are being delivered is we put some of the features that are in the airplane, and as soon as certification occurs, they will be essentially turned on.
Got it. It'll be fun to actually see the extra button there in the aircraft. So I recently talked with somebody that was interested in buying a G1, and they were curious about all the different features from the G2 that can be retrofitted into the G1. Which ones could someone who buys an older Vision Jet add to that aircraft?
So right now, we currently have retrofits available for our G1 airplanes that are the G2 features, which include our noise reduction in the cabin. The premium carpet can now be installed in the airplane. FlightStream 510 can be installed in the airplane. And those are the main items at this moment.
And I know last year that the Vision Jet was the most shipped business jet. Tell me about this year. What are shipments like?
So this year, the shipments increased even more from 60 airplanes last year to 80 airplanes this year.
Wow, that's great. So it looks like the simulator here at the Vision Center is pretty busy.
That is correct. The simulator's been very busy. In fact, we just had our 300th type rating that's been received here in Knoxville, Tennessee.
That's great. And I'm proud to have my name up on the board there as number 115. And so I would imagine, just based on all the innovation we've seen at Cirrus in the past for the SR22s, that you must be thinking about, additional new things for the Vision Jet in the future.
We're always innovating. It's in the Cirrus DNA, whether it's our SR product line to our Vision Jet product line. We will be making flying more enjoyable, for our customers in the future, and as we add more and more features and more utility to the airplane.
Matt, we'll be back to hear more soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Also, while in Knoxville, I spoke briefly via FaceTime with Robert DeLaurentis, who we talked with back in August in episode 119 about his upcoming polar circumnavigation. Unfortunately, we had a bad connection, so I wasn't able to record his thoughts before he left. But I did talk with him at length 2 days later, just after he successfully circled the South Pole. Here's that conversation. Hello, Robert. Do you hear me?
I can hear you.
So we last talked in August about your planned circumnavigation, and we wanted to get an update on where you are and what's been happening. So tell us, where are you?
I'm in Ushuaia, Argentina right now after successful completion of the South Pole flight, which lasted 18 hours and was about 4,200 nautical miles.
Wow. And was that the part of the circumnavigation that you thought was going to be the most difficult?
It was. And in fact, I feel like, with that behind me, the stress level can drop a bit. I prepared for 2 years just for that one day. And, I could probably make an argument I've been preparing a lot longer for this trip than just the 2 years, because that first circumnavigation was really a warm-up for this pole-to-pole flight.
Mm-hmm. So tell us how the aircraft performed. I know when we last talked, you were making a lot of different modifications, and you weren't really sure what kind of performance you would get from the aircraft.
That's right. And, I only tested it at about 80% ferry fuel. So I had never flown the plane at 100%. I had a senior R&D engineer from Scale Composites look at my test data and project what the performance of the plane would be, at 100% ferry fuel. But I had the advantage of being at sea level here in Ushuaia, and it was also a fairly cold day. The runway was about 9,200 feet, and it was kind of, the tires were bulging, the struts had about an inch left on each of them, and I was just very concerned how the plane would take off, what kind of load the landing gear could take. And certainly the engineer who designed the wing had done the feasibility study and told me, how much it could take. So to get the plane moving, I needed a little extra throttle to brake, the friction, and taxied out to runway 25. And unfortunately, that runway sort of puts you directly in line with the mountain. But it was a strong, probably 15 to 20 knot wind down the runway. So I didn't really have a choice. There was no way I was going to take off with a 15 to 20 knot tailwind. But my concern was, of course, how would the plane turn? Because you lose lift in a turn. So I was sitting there on the runway and feet on the brakes, full throttle, and released the brakes, and the plane started to roll a little bit slower than usual. But I would say by half the runway, I was at about 105 knots. Normally I rotate about 85. But since the plane was heavier, I needed that extra speed, and it lifted off. And the flight characteristics were extremely similar to what I would normally experience just with a normal fuel load. And I was in sort of disbelief that that plane could operate like that. With so much power and such a great Gulfstream wing, I guess I couldn't comprehend that it could fly that well. And I was climbing at 1,800 feet per minute.
Wow.
Normally I might climb somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000. So I was just so impressed and proud of the plane. And at that instant, I had this thought that, I think I can do this. I think the plane could do it.
Tell us how much fuel you took off with and how much did you land with?
I can tell you that I had 6 extra fuel tanks in the plane that were full, and then I landed with about 300 pounds in each wing. And as I was flying over the Drake Passage, I was very concerned, very, very concerned. In fact, I used the last of my biofuels coming back in because I didn't think I could make it over the Drake Passage with what I had. And my thought was, I'll try and pick up some more biofuels, in Europe, which they're much more plentiful there. But I needed that fuel to get home. And, when you set out on a 4,200-mile leg, you have no idea what the winds will be. Certainly, I studied the weather for probably a day and a half. I had a guy named Mike Jesh, who I think looking at the weather patterns with me, and we altered my course to the west so that I could take advantage of tailwinds on the way down and then hopefully tailwinds on the way back. I can tell you that the weather report was not accurate, at least on the way down. So I had burned up some extra fuel that I really didn't expect to. And of course, you have to make that decision at your bingo point or as you get closer to it. Do I turn back early or do I go all the way to the South Pole? Obviously, I went all the way.
That must have been a tough decision. What led you to make that decision to keep going?
My fuel calculations, I thought I had enough. And the plane was flying fairly well, fast. I got up to 28,000 feet in about 58 minutes. So again, I was impressed with the performance of the plane. I thought, geez, if it can get up to that altitude in such a quick time, I'm going to really see some speed out of this thing. So, all the indications were good. Of course, any failure in the ferry system would have resulted in, having to land somewhere. So I was keenly aware of that, with my 20 fuel valves and 6 tanks, 5 of them pressurized because they were in the cabin of the plane. And of course, one was in the luggage compartment, which required fuel pumps, electric fuel pumps powered by ship's power. I had a backup system when I was test flying it where I could connect a start pack battery to the electric pumps in case the power from the ship failed. But in this case, I didn't want to bring along, another 100 pounds of weight when I felt like it was at my very limits.
And so what kind of winds aloft did you experience and what kind of true air speeds was the aircraft capable of?
The fastest I saw out of the plane was about 280 knots ground speed. I didn't do any true speed calculations. I was just concerned about, how fast I was moving across the ground because that would get me back home.
Mm-hmm. And what were the maximum headwinds and tailwinds that you experienced?
Headwinds, I would say up to 80 knots.
Yikes.
On departure when I was expecting a tailwind. And on the way back up, about 30 knots tailwind.
Boy, that must have really felt good to know you had a tailwind on the way home.
Yeah, and it was almost the whole way, Max, until I got over the Drake Passage, which was a concern because that's where that C-130 went down last week. And it's some of the worst weather in the world right there. It's known for that. And as I was getting closer and I was getting low on fuel, I thought, wow, I really need this tailwind to continue. And then it dropped off. And it was the first time, I'm sorry, I'm getting some noise here. It was the first time in my life I ever saw on my GPS unit the word calm instead of a direction and vector.
So what was it like flying over Antarctica?
No pun intended. It was at first chilling. I was terrified just to look out and see the vast distances with nothing except snow. And you could see these mountaintops just sort of piercing the surface of this white expanse. And I knew from reading and doing research on the internet that in some points there's over 9,000 feet of ice and snow in Antarctica. And most of the continent is actually at sea level, if not for the ice and snow that's built up. So I had the sense of being very much alone, feeling like I was 100% dependent on that plane. And from our conversations that every system that we installed failed in some way until we could sort of fine tune it and get the bugs worked out. So, did I have a ton of confidence in the plane? No. I assessed my chances of about 50%, making it back safely. And I remember walking out of my hotel room thinking to myself, what are you doing? This is insanity. This is a 1983 aircraft. You don't have the experience to fly over Antarctica. The weather is unpredictable. The temperatures were a huge concern as well, due to possibility of fuel gelling and then the operational temperatures of the engines. So, yeah, I was quite honestly afraid. And I'd say about 2/3 of the way down, I just sort of calmed down a bit and realized that the plane was operating quite well, that, this was going to be a bit of an autopilot flight. And the one thing I knew about turbines is once they're up in the air and stabilized, they just keep going. So at that point, I relaxed a bit. It seemed like the trip was going, relatively quickly. And then once I crossed over the South Pole, which is a story in itself, I started to realize the clock seemed to be going a little slower. And I thought, I'm not out of the woods yet because I still have to make it all the way back. And I've been doing my best to calculate fuel, but I'm very much dependent on the weather and a push from behind. So, yeah, it was terrifying, I guess is the word. But, here I am back, and I accomplished what I had set out to do. And I think it was a pretty memorable moment for me, and hopefully for the other people that were following.
And we exchanged messages earlier. You told me that the pole was fogged over. How did you know when you were at the pole? What equipment were you using?
Well, I knew because I was talking to the air traffic controller at the South Pole, for one. Two, I had multiple GPS units that were showing the pole. Unfortunately, the flight management systems were failing as I got closer and closer to the pole. My iPad, which was aligned to use a magnetic input instead of true, to head for the magnetic pole as opposed to the true North Pole, still continue to work. And the flight management systems got me to within about 10 miles, and then I dead reckoned using a directional gyro. So, I had multiple indications. I also was using a line of position on the sun. I took note of that, as I lined up. And I was headed at 180 degrees south when I passed over.
And how long did you hang out over the pole? Did you do a few turns around the point?
I did 2 circles around the pole, one for the planet and one for the people. And then I headed out as quickly as I could. So I didn't want to, waste any fuel when I needed to be getting back. But I did shift to biofuels when I was about 15 minutes out, and they worked perfectly. So I was really happy about that.
So tell us about that. I wasn't aware that you were carrying 2 different kinds of fuel. How much did you carry of each, and what was your plan for switching between the 2?
Yeah, I had the biofuels in my 4th ferry tank, which I had gotten from Gulfstream up in Long Beach. They very generously donated 200 gallons. So I had 145 in that ferry tank. And I know from experience using the tanks, it takes about an hour to drain each tank using the cabin pressurization to push the fuel up into the wings. So at about 15 minutes out, I started the cross-connect process, and left it on until about 15 minutes after I crossed the pole. So in my estimation, I used about 72.5 gallons, or at least transferred that amount into the tanks.
Now, I recall reading that you had a scientific experiment on board, but I really don't know any of the details of it. Tell us about that.
Yeah, actually, I have 2 scientific experiments that I'm flying right now. One of them is a wafer-scale spaceship that's funded by NASA, and I have that on the window co-pilot side, just aft of the co-pilot seat. And then I have a particle collection experiment, which entails basically using sticky tape on the outside of the plane to connect or collect particles along the way. So we were testing for microfibers, which are basically the synthetic fibers that are in your clothes. And they've worked their way into our water system on the planet. In fact, they've found them in some of the most remote places on the planet. They've found them at the South and North Poles on the ground, but nobody's tested in the air. So this was the first time testing over the South Pole for plastics in the air. And it was funny because I was talking to a guy named Corey, who was the air traffic controller there, explaining, that we had these experiments and it was the first time using biofuels. And he was really excited. And I guess people started to gather around him at the South Pole station. And I interviewed him, on the radio just for about 5 minutes, talking about what it was like to live at the South Pole and, what some of his experiences were with other aircraft and how he liked it. So I'll be sharing that on social media and also in our documentary coming up called Peace Pilot to the Ends of the Earth and Beyond.
And I know you had some in-flight communications where you were texting with folks. You and I had texted back at one point in time. How was that as a kind of companion, and were there any special ways in which you used that along the way?
Right. I used a InReach Explorer that was provided to me by the SATCOM store, and it was invaluable because when I departed from Argentina, I got handed off to the Chilean air traffic controllers, and my HF radio was not receiving, it was transmitting. So I had a backup, again, from the SatPhone store. It was an Iridium Go that I could sync to my iPhone via Bluetooth. So Rothera Research Station sent me a text message on the InReach Explorer and gave me the phone number for the Chilean air traffic controller. So I was calling them every hour, reporting my position. And the first time I attempted to call, I identified myself, they recognized me, and then we lost the connection. And what I didn't realize is that they had started a search and rescue effort because I was not responding to the HF communications we had. And even though I had made it through on the sat phone, they started the search and rescue effort, and Rothera notified them that they were in touch with me and that they could cancel that. So we had a little bit of drama there early on, but I sorted out the communications. And some of my position reports were also on the InReach. And of course, they're time late because, the satellites need to link up, and sometimes it could take up to an hour. But I would say that was the single best piece of survival gear I had in that plane.
Let's talk about other kinds of survival gear. Did you have any type of an immersion suit or anything like that?
Yeah, I had my immersion suit on up to my waist, which is pretty typical with, ferry pilots. And you asked what survival gear did I actually have on my body?
Sure. What did you bring with you?
Yeah, I had a personal locator beacon around my neck as well. I believe is it ACR? It's a little yellow device, and I could transmit a signal with that. I had my InReach. I, of course, had a throw bag with all my survival gear that was prepared for me by CAPS Aviation. Actually, the PLB is by Artex. I'm sorry, I think it's the ACR and then Artex. I also had a 6-person life raft, and in my side pocket, I had a knife in case I had to cut my way out of my seatbelt. I had an airbag, and then I had some warm clothes on too, and a cap. But yeah, most of the actual survival gear was in the survival bag.
I saw one of your posts on social media. Tell us how cold it was outside when you were flying at altitude.
It was interesting. It ranged from about minus 40 Celsius, and at one point I saw minus 60 on my outside air temperature digital gauge. The steam gauge read much higher than that, or much lower than that. So I was going based on my digital instruments. And then on the Avidyne 550, I had a saturated air temperature indication, or I'm sorry, static air temperature indication. And it was probably the one I relied on the most because I knew that that would be the most accurate. And that one got as low as about minus 53 for most of, actually, I take that back. It was minus 40, as high as minus 53. And then for a brief moment in time, that outside air temperature gauge, not the steam gauge, but the digital one, read minus 60. So, somewhere between those numbers is the truth.
And it's summer now down there. What are the temperatures like where you're at in Argentina?
I'd say right now it's about 40 degrees Fahrenheit outside. And the thing that was interesting is I was talking to Corey at the South Pole, and I believe the temperature at that time was minus 43, and he said it was about 20 degrees warmer on the ground. So I thought that was interesting that it was only a 20-degree temperature change, between where he was and where I was up at 32,000.
Wow, that's amazing, because the standard lapse rate would be 2 degrees per 1,000 feet. So you're right. That's a pretty small difference.
Yeah, that was interesting to me. I had so much going on, though. I was just, trying to go according to my checklist that I had created for crossing the South Pole.
Well, I think you've had, 2 nights sleep since you got back? And what was it like to be able to sleep the first night?
Actually, it's just been one night. Last night, it's right now it's just about noontime here. But I got back and I had 2 hours of processing in the airport, waiting for immigration and, customs. And technically, I wasn't supposed to be back before 48 hours because there's a rule when you leave a country. So it created an additional delay, but I got back to my hotel room and slept for a couple hours, and then I just couldn't sleep anymore. There's a lot of adrenaline in my system. A lot of people were reaching out to me, checking in on me. And I ended up going out for a really nice crab dinner because Ushuaia is known for having some amazing king crab. So I did that, and then finally went back at about 10 p.m. and had a great night's sleep.
And how many days were you there before the weather seemed right before you launched your trip?
I was in Ushuaia for about 4 or 5 days before, and a lot of that, Max, was spent fueling the plane because it's a very slow process, stripping stuff out of the plane, getting it back to my hotel, working with the flight plan center here to get an acceptable flight plan in the system, getting a permit from Chile to overfly at the very last minute. We were able to get that in 30 minutes when it normally takes 48 hours. And we were told that we didn't need a permit. And then the day of, the air traffic controller, or actually the tower operator, wouldn't let me take off because I didn't have it. And I explained that the flight plan office had been working with me for several days, and they said it wasn't necessary since I wasn't flying over Chile. They said, well, the air traffic control system is centered around them and you need a permit. So I literally had to go back to the flight plan office, and we had a overflight permit from several days before, but we filed another request and then called them directly and convinced them to approve it on the spot. Really what they want is your billing information, which they got, and God only knows what that's going to cost.
That's funny. It's all about the money, isn't it?
Sometimes it feels like it.
That's all right. Now, do I understand that you didn't fly over Chile, but that you went through an area that was administered by Chilean airspace, and that's why you needed the permit?
Yes, that's absolutely correct. The FIR is controlled by Chile. So I went out the channel here next to Ushuaia and purposely avoided their airspace, or not their airspace, but the land that they own. And once you get past that line of demarcation out in the ocean, nobody controls that. That's usually about 10 miles out. And although many countries claim land in Antarctica, the Antarctic Treaty basically says that nobody owns it. So even the U.S. station at the South Pole is not on U.S. land. It's land that's claimed by Chile, but obviously not enforced. And the other thing is, in that treaty, I've read it. It says that none of these member countries can restrict the flight over Antarctica at any time, but yet they have claims. And they require permits and approval from their scientific community. It's really a very political place right now.
And tell us what the FIR is.
That's the division between airspaces that are controlled by different countries. I don't even know what FIR stands for exactly, but on the Jeppesen charts, it very clearly says, which country controls that airspace.
So tell me about some of the unique challenges that you faced on this particular trip.
There was really two other challenges. Maybe one of them didn't amount to what I thought it might. It had to do with snow blindness. And I believe there was an L-1011 that had crashed in Antarctica. They were doing a sort of a scenic flight with a plane load of people, and they couldn't distinguish between the snow and the clouds. So what I did was I went to Shade and Eyewear, where we created some flip sunglasses that were perfect for, low light and higher light situations. But I didn't think that would be enough. So I had some clip-on sunglasses that I had bought during the solar eclipse up in the Pacific Northwest, and I had those with me. Then I had some plastic sheets that I could stick onto the windshield that offered a little more filtration. But surprisingly, the flip sunglasses by Shaden, which we call the Shaden Zens, worked perfectly. And there was not, so much light that I was blinded. The other thing was the pilot fatigue, because by the time I got my flight plan sorted out and got the permit for Chile and left at a time so that when I came back, the airport would be open, it was 2:30 in the afternoon. And I was honestly fatigued by that time. And I was thinking, gosh, I'm taking off on an 18-hour flight, but I'm already tired. So adrenaline kept me going for about 16 hours of that. And then as I got closer to Argentina and I got closer to the Drake Passage, I just was overwhelmed. So I thought I would try some micro naps, which I had planned on doing before. And I knew that the Solar Impulse had used micro naps as well. So quite honestly, I set my phone and took a few 5-minute naps, and the plane continued to run. And I think on some level, I was listening to the engines while I was sleeping, but I did wake up to sort of a rough or a little bit of a minor vibration, which I thought, well, am I imagining this? And I thought, no, I'm experiencing this. And then it went away. So I think I, got a brief period of time where I rested a bit, but extremely fatiguing and didn't feel, great at that point. And then the other surprise that happened was I had lost contact with that Chilean air traffic controller because the sat phone number I was using didn't work anymore as I got closer, which didn't make any sense. So I needed a way to get down, and it was a solid layer of cloud cover. I thought, two options. One of them was to fly directly over the airport at Ushuaia, where I knew I could get a communication link, with the tower, and then potentially go from there, or just go directly to the instrument approach and do that. But then I'd be mixing in with, other traffic that may be landing. So what I decided to do is just on my way in out of the ocean, I dropped down below the clouds, and, I didn't have an altimeter setting that I knew was correct, but I came out and I estimated about 2,000 feet above the water, that's where the cloud deck was. And then I dropped down to about 1,500 feet and flew the channel VFR, which was about a 60-mile, leg. So I came in VFR, got approval from the tower, and landed. And part of the reason I didn't want to go in under instruments is I thought I'm, fatigued. There's mountains around this airport. I'm anticipating being able to talk to these guys, but I'm not 100% sure. Maybe I'll just go back to the fundamentals of my training and fly in, VFR.
Yeah, VFR can be very handy. I sometimes use it on some of my trips across the country moving airplanes. Now, this leg was 18 hours. What do you think is going to be the next longest leg on the trip?
I think it's going to be across the South Atlantic from Natal, Brazil, over to Africa. And, there's a shorter distance, but you go into a part of the country that's not as stable. I'm probably going to do that anyway, just to avoid a longer ocean leg. But I'm thinking that that's, if my memory serves me, closer to 3,000 nautical miles. So that's the next longest one.
Okay. And what about your trip over the North Pole? How long a leg do you think that'll be?
I think that's a little over 2,000. So compared to, some of the legs I've been doing, I think that's pretty reasonable.
Well, you still have a lot of flying ahead of you and a lot of months. Where do people go to follow you online so they can actually see your position and also send messages to you during the trip?
They can go to the website, www.pole2poleflight, or they could go to Twitter, Instagram, Pinterest, YouTube, any of those places, Facebook, of course, and communicate with me. And then the InReach Explorer also offers an opportunity for them to text me while I'm up in the air.
And they can find that through the website.
Yes.
That's great. Well, Robert, congratulations to you on what appears to be the longest, most difficult leg of the flight. And we'll look forward to following you throughout the rest of your trip.
Yeah, thanks, Max. I appreciate your interest. I appreciate you staying in touch. And, I certainly appreciate what you're doing online and out there in the world with respect to teaching pilots and making them safer for all of us.
Well, thanks so much for being an inspiration to all of us on what's possible and how people can dream big.
It's interesting, Max, because some of the younger people that I've been encountering seem very inspired by the trip. Maybe, the millennials is the group that I'm talking about. And I always had understood that they didn't feel like they had, hope, that they couldn't really make it in the world because the way things were stacked against them, it was so hard. But I'm finding that some of my big supporters are those younger people, and they're seeing that, you can take what seems like an impossible situation and, come out with a positive outcome. So I think they're the ones with the hope. And it's just really nice to be around that energy. And, people haven't heard the word no as much at that age. So they're not afraid to give it a try.
Yeah, it's amazing what you can accomplish when you kind of think about what might be possible.
Yeah, absolutely.
Super.
And how nice to surprise yourself,
Oh, yeah.
when you find out it is.
Yeah, totally. Well, good luck to you, sir. Have a great time and have a lot of fun. And we'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks, Max.
I'll put a link in the show notes to the website where you can track Robert on his travels around the world and even send him a satellite text message via his Garmin InReach Explorer. Now, to wrap things up, I had a short conversation with John Bone, who we talked with over a year ago in episode 83. He talked with us then about his plans to land his Cirrus SR20 in Antarctica. And the difference is that Robert, who we just heard from, flew around the South Pole but didn't land there. John's plan was actually to land his plane in Antarctica. Here's that conversation. So I'm here in Knoxville, and John Bone is giving me a ride back to the hotel so I can pick up my luggage for the next flight across the country in a new Cirrus. But John, we talked about a year ago about your planned trip in your Cirrus to Antarctica. Give us an update on what's happened over the past year and what your plans are.
What's happened over the last year, Max, is that I still haven't been successful in obtaining a landing permit down on King George Island from Chile, but I'm working on it. Unfortunately, just about the time I was going to get it, they had political unrest in Chile, and there's a travel alert and a state of emergency and curfews, and the fellows that I'm working with there have asked me if I would mind waiting a year until they get their political unrest resolved. So I still have it on my list. Hopefully 1 year from this month, I'll be on my way down there.
John, thanks so much for the update and good luck to you.
Thank you so much, Max. Great to talk to you again.
And that's the rest of their stories. Now let me tell you what's up with me. I'm just now finishing the last of 4 trips that I started about 13 days ago. The first was to Knoxville to bring back a new SR-22 with a client. We left Knoxville late in the day on Monday, December the 16th. Our goal was to get at least a few hours in before we stopped so that we would have a chance of making it all the way home the following day. But we had a line of thunderstorms which was approaching, stretched all the way from the Gulf of Mexico up to the Toronto area in Canada. So no way to get around that line of storms, and the tops were pretty high. So when we departed Knoxville, we climbed initially to 3,500 feet because, guess what? At that altitude, there were 50-knot winds. Now, fortunately, it was not a direct headwind, but we did have a 20-knot headwind component. Later, we went to 4,000 feet and became IFR because we were just starting to see a few scattered clouds. Now, our aspirational destination that evening was Baton Rouge, KBTR, but we were late leaving and the storms got there first. So then we decided we would update our destination to Jackson, Mississippi, but the same thing happened there as well. Finally, we diverted to Meridian, Louisiana. And I got to tell you, we had a great time sitting in the restaurant balcony that night watching the electrical storm getting rained on. Now, if you wonder why we're out there doing it, in Northern California where I live, the air coming off the ocean is so cold that we rarely have thunderstorms. On average, we get 1 to 2 a year out near the coast. So for me, it's always kind of fun to see a good thunderstorm. So the next day we had low clouds, and so we departed IFR. We were at 4,000 feet, again, to beat the headwinds, but we found we were picking up light ice. Now, of course, the SR-22T in this case had FIKI, flight into known icing capability. However, that's not intended for you to stay on the ice continuously. It's intended for you to transition through the ice to get on top. Well, we found that the clouds were relatively low, so we climbed up to 4,500 feet, which did put us on top. And so we were IFR with a VFR on top clearance at 4,500 feet. And we flew that way all the way to Lubbock, Texas, which was 5.3 hours. And there we had sandwiches waiting for us from Domino's. We had actually called ahead using the Iridium phone that's available as an option in the SR-22T to have our order waiting for us, which was great. It minimized our time on the ground and kept us going. Departing Lubbock, we climbed initially to 8,500 feet, and we had a 13-knot headwind. Later, we climbed to 16,500 feet, and at that point, as we were getting into California, the headwinds had dropped to just about zero, and eventually, we got a little bit of a tailwind. And I think when I saw it 16,500, our true airspeed was somewhere up around, I think, 185 or 190. We were doing about 220 knots across the ground. So the end of the trip was a heck of a lot faster than the beginning of the trip. As I got out of the airplane in Oakland that evening to climb into an Uber, I had a message from someone who asked me to call him back, and it turned out that it was someone I had not met before, and he said that he was picking up a new Vision Jet, and could I be available to go to Knoxville 2 days later to help fly him back? So I said yes, of course. So I had 1 day home and then flew out the next day, which would have been Thursday, to Knoxville, where I did first in the morning a transition training for the G2. Turns out that there is a couple hours of training that's required because of differences between the G2 version and the G1 version. A lot of that has to do with the auto throttle, which, by the way, is just a game changer. I am so impressed with the capabilities of the auto throttle. We'll talk about that in detail in a future show. We ended up leaving Knoxville about noon that day and went first to Decorah, Iowa. That's KDEH, where the client had a business meeting. And then from there, we flew on to either Cheyenne or Rock Springs, Wyoming. I had a couple of trips in the same airplane that week, and I can't remember which stop because I've been to both of those stops, Cheyenne twice and Rock Springs once. And from there, we flew into Oakland, California, arriving on Friday evening. Well, I was home there for a day, Saturday, and the owner said that he would like me to help him get to a meeting in Iowa on that Monday. Originally, he asked me whether or not I would fly him out kind of as a red-eye flight on Sunday night, leaving at 10 p.m. and arriving in the wee hours. And I said, from a risk management standpoint, that just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So what we arranged was for him to fly into Chicago O'Hare Airport using a red-eye flight, and I flew all day during Sunday to get the aircraft in position for him to pick him up on Monday morning. So that was fun. And since I had to cancel a flight lesson on Sunday, I brought that pilot along with me, and he was incredibly helpful from the right seat. We flew first to Centennial Airport in Denver, and from there we then flew into Chicago O'Hare. Now, I did record the audio from our landing at Chicago O'Hare, and I'll make that available at some point in the future. Early the next morning, the client arrived and we got in the airplane and we were on our way just a little bit before 7. But I got to say, I have never been on so many ground frequencies at one airport at one time. We started at Signature over on the northeast side of the field, and where we were parked, we could see a sign that said we should contact metering ground. I think it was on 121.75. And when we called metering, they gave us a frequency to call. And from there, we talked to one or two ground frequencies. They switched us to a tower frequency, crossed us across the runway, back to another ground frequency or two, and then finally to the tower. It felt like about 7 frequency changes. And finally, we were able to depart 28 right and get on our way. Now, on the way to 28 right from Signature, we went past one of the main terminals with lots of airliners parked there. And somebody jumped on the ground frequency and said, "Hey, Cirrus, your strobes are on." Well, unbeknownst to me, I guess it's fairly common airline practice to keep the strobes off when they're on the ground. And unbeknownst to them, we are required to have our strobe lights on at all times. What's the difference between us and an airliner? Well, guess what? They have a rotating tail beacon, which is their anti-collision light. We do not. Our strobes are our required anti-collision light, so they have to stay on all the time according to the rules. So never assume that just because practices are done one way in a particular type of aircraft, that they're done that way in all aircraft. Anyway, we then went on to Decorah, Iowa, picked up a colleague of my client, flew from there to another city in Iowa where he had a meeting to attend, flew back to Decorah. And when we were there, we had a surprise guest waiting for us. I want to thank Bill Remington, one of our Patreon supporters. Bill had seen some of my posts on Facebook the day before and said, "Hey, I see you were in my hometown here at Decorah." And I said, yes, we'd be there twice again the following day. And so the second time, he came out to say hello to us. So great pleasure to meet him. He has offered that in a future trip, I can stay at his home there if I'd like, and that might actually happen. So that was quite fun to meet Bill, and I want to thank him for coming out to the airport. From there, we went on to, again, either Cheyenne or Rock Springs. Like I said, I've been to both multiple times, and then back to Concord, California. I was home on the 24th and the 25th for Christmas, and on the 25th, I learned that another Vision Jet that I thought was going to be scheduled to pick up a few days later actually was available early. So I went out on the 26th of December to fly via the airlines to Knoxville, and on the 27th, we flew back a new Vision Jet. Now, we had ferocious winds that actually were 100 knots at flight level 300. Now, they weren't a direct headwind, but at times we did have about 65 knots on the nose. So we needed a couple of stops to get back here. So we stopped first in Topeka, where we refueled, then went on to Cheyenne, where I had been just 4 days before. As I recall, we were there on a Monday and on a Friday. And then we flew the rest of the way into Medford, Oregon, where this plane is going to live for a while. And so that's the rest of my story. I'm now going to catch a commercial flight from Medford down to the San Francisco Bay Area here on Saturday so that we can go to a party in the evening. And guess what I'll be doing on Sunday? Yes, flying with some of the clients who I haven't been able to fly with for the past 2 weeks. So I want to thank everybody for their patience, both clients who I fly with and for people who have emailed me, because it's just been an incredibly crazy, busy couple of weeks. And by the way, on some of these trips, I was able to pass along information to our Patreon supporters on how they could track the trip. Surprisingly, a couple of these airplanes were already set up for blocking of their call signs, so there was not an effective way to track them. And the Garmin InReach that I brought did not work in those aircraft because I've noticed in the past I have trouble receiving GPS in the Vision Jet. And I think it's probably because of some shielding that's built into the windshield. So I'll continue to investigate other ways that we can help you track flights in the future. But on those flights where we did have tracking, I want to thank so much the Patreons who contacted me via Garmin InReach. We had great fun talking while we were in the air. And if you would like to become part of this awesome group of supporters, you can just go to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, where you can use a credit card to send us a few dollars a month to help support the show. Now, here's some email. Longtime patron supporter Derek Thomas wrote, I love this, by the way, it's hilarious. So I dreamed last night that I was at a meeting and there was an aircraft out the window which I expressed a desire to fly. Wish granted. I walked out there and you, referring to me, Max, are showing me the walk-around pre-flight, and turns out you're the CFI doing my intro flight. Anyway, it was a Cessna 172, busted LOL. So, of course, having studied some psychology in the past, I had to find out, hey, what he thought the dream meant. And he replied, 2020 is the year I go for my PPL, finally. Well, good for you, Derek. I think that's great. And I look forward to hearing more about your adventure getting your private. And Deb Gangwish wrote, love the podcast. I learned so much from each of your shows. Thanks to your podcast, I'm continually inspired to be a better pilot and a steadfast advocate for general aviation. I'm a 54-year-old mother of 5 and earned my PPL on September 21st of this year. Congratulations, Deb. That's awesome. I own a little 1973 Cherokee 180, also known as the Challenger. She's a loyal lady, and I'm blessed to own my own plane. Maybe someday I'll be able to get a Cirrus. Hope to meet you someday. Until then, keep up the fantastic work. May your holidays be blessed. Thanks, Deb. That's so great to hear from you. And Matthew Frame wrote from Australia to say, Merry Christmas, mate. Thank you for everything you do. You touch people's lives in a way that keeps people's dreams alive. Stay safe. Well, that's very kind of you, Matthew. Thanks so much. I appreciate that. And then here's an email from Brett. He says, how are you? I should be super excited and happy to tell you that I bought a plane, but it didn't go quite as expected. And listening to your most recent podcast about the happy story of bringing home someone's new Cirrus, I wanted to offer up my story to you, since it went almost completely opposite of that one in many of your other trips. It provides many lessons on what not to do when buying a plane. I learned a lot in the process and want to pass it on to others so they don't make the same mistakes. If you think you might be interested, I can share it with you, and you can see if it's worth passing on to others. As always, thank you for all you do to help keep us pilots safe. I know that the few things that did go well on my trip did so because of some things that I've learned from your podcast, so thanks. Well, thanks so much for your email, Brett. And as we wrap up here, I just received an email from AOPA Foundation. You may have received one as well. They're looking for 261 generous pilots to donate in the next 72 hours before the end of the year. You can get to their donation site by just going to aopa.org, click on donate in the upper right corner. If you do that before midnight, December 31st, it's going to be tax deductible to the full extent of the law for the year 2019. And I mention this because I had planned to have AOPA Foundation Vice President Jennifer Storm on the show sometime this past couple of months, but I have been so incredibly busy I wasn't able to fit it in, but I don't want that to hurt the foundation, so I hope you will consider going out to aopa.org, click on donate, and donate to this great organization. So just a quick reminder, probably the best way to communicate with me is if you'd like to send a message, go out to aviationnewstalk.com and click on contact on the top of the page, or you can record a listener question or a fun flying destination. I've got a couple new ones that I'll share with you in an upcoming show, but we can always use more. If you have a favorite airport and you want to share that information with others about what you like about it, what you like to do there, go to aviationnewstalk.com and click on listener questions at the top of the page. You'll have up to 90 seconds to record either a listener question or to talk about your fun flying destination. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and have a very happy new year.